Hello, Susanne Lyons. Thank you very much for joining us. Chair of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee's Board of Directors, and Danita Johnson, the Head of Business Operations at DC United. Hello, ladies.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. I'm going to get out of the way and let Eben and his Bob Ross painting take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Danita and Susanne, for joining. Susanne, I don't know if you caught much of the last panel, but I'm sitting here listening to Jesse talk about the challenges for surfing, a new Olympic sport, in the pandemic. And my mind is thinking, Team USA has to deal with these conversations for dozens of sports and governing bodies around the country. If you don't mind, take us into your brain for the past 12 months from a business standpoint. What's been the biggest challenge for moving the 2020 Tokyo Games into 2021 for all of your teams?
Well, no question, COVID is one of the biggest challenges that I think the Olympics and Paralympics have ever faced. And it falls squarely upon the athletes who really had their whole time schedule for training upended. And we have some remarkable videos on teamusa.org of how the athletes adapted. We have swimmers who would get in these little kiddie pools with giant rubber bands, attached to their feet and, swim in these little pools. Or we had a rock climber, one of the other new sports, who was just climbing around her parents' living room. So they had like a rock facing on the walls, and they found adaptive ways to keep training, particularly during those early months when certainly there were no gyms open, there were no pools open. So, that's been the biggest challenge, is having them not just physically be ready and to adjust the timing of their training, but mentally, how did they adjust to that, complete change in orientation? And mental health really has been, I think, a challenge for everybody involved, but we're still planning on going. Tokyo will be a tremendous challenge, but we're doing everything we can to make it safe. And, knock on wood, they will get there. They will have their heart's desires filled to be able to compete and represent America.
What's the executive equivalent of jumping in the kiddie pool, Danita or Susanne? Are there things that you guys have had to do, deals you've closed from, while vacuuming your house, like just doing things because the pandemic is different now than things were before? Just having to change your approach during working from home.
Well, Danita, you want to take it and
Sure.
I'll add?
I think on a funny note, I probably make breakfast more than I probably ever have in my adult life. But no, it's definitely been a change, balancing between like being at home and working at the same time. But I think it's also a good change. It gives you a nice sense of balance. Obviously, we all miss the office space at the same time, but that ability to be a little bit more flexible in our days, I think, has added and given us some diversity in our work that we get to able to do between a home life and work life. So I do appreciate that piece of it. But I definitely miss the interaction every day with staff and having that as part of that day to day. Especially for me, as I started my new role, I'm getting to know everybody virtually. And so it's definitely a different essence versus being in the office together.
I was going to ask, I can empathize with that. I changed jobs last year during the pandemic. There are colleagues who've done presentations in this event that I have not met in person yet. How has that transition been for you, going from not just a new job, but a sport, basketball, that you've been a lifer in, to a totally new one in soccer that I imagine has some similarities and also some differences?
Yeah, from the sport, really, it's getting to know all the different athletes, I know and understand the game, but learning more about it, getting more ingrained with the MLS. Like, obviously, I've worked in basketball for many years, so I could talk about it for days and days, right? But being able just to have that institutional knowledge and history of the league is something that I'm really making sure that I take the time, continue to invest and learn in, because I think it's very important to know where things came from, how they were developed, to help create direction for where they can go. So as far as switching sports, I think that's my approach when it comes to the game. When it comes to the business side, I think there's a lot of commonalities across the sports industry that we are able to now come together and do as one, from all the different experiences from each of the people in my front office.
I've heard you say in interviews, ask kind of the difference between the W and the NBA is kind of an access to easy resources in some ways. Mm-hmm. Where does MLS fit into kind of the experiences you've had across a bunch of different things?
I think the uniqueness with MLS is the continued league integration into the things that we do. I feel fully supported in the capacity of what the league is doing and what they're offering. And they're wanting me to continue to push forward innovation and continue to push forward the game. It does definitely remind me of my time in the NBA and the WNBA, because that was part of what drew you. That it's like you're all shooting for this next thing, right? To push it forward, to change the game. And I feel like MLS is definitely making that presence known in the States.
Susanne, Danita just mentioned innovation there. How do you think about the Olympics in that regard as you're balancing everything you mentioned at the beginning, pushing an Olympics from one year to another? How do you also think about innovation simultaneously? Is that possible in these conditions?
Well, it's a great question, and I actually think that having a crisis sometimes can make a great deal of new innovation happen. The Olympics is not known as being super nimble and cutting edge innovative. It's a pretty traditional environment and movement. However, in the last year, we've had to really adjust to the fact that, first of all, we couldn't get on planes and travel all over the world. Normally, I would be 35% of my time traveling to other countries to international meetings about the Olympics and Paralympics. So we discovered we could do a lot more through technology than we thought we could before. We've been much more innovative, I think, in figuring out how to push out to the athletes things that they need, information that they need, whether it's on mental health, whether it's on health and wellness, whether it's on COVID and what kind of protocols they need to be addressing. We have found ways to create both forums and education mechanisms that get that information out in a way we weren't able to do before, and probably arguably better. And I would say we also have begun to innovate in certain areas where we're beginning to try to figure out where do esports integrate with physical sport. We know that, in America and all over the world, young people I had a son who was on his Xbox all the time. That's a huge part of their life. So how does that intersect? How do we begin to figure out the balance between physical sport and also the excitement and the interest that everyone has in esport? So those are some of the areas where just in the last year, we've really begun to make some headway, and partly because we've had challenges in front of us.
Danita, I saw you nodding your head for a part of that. It sounds like you agree that there's, during times like this, innovation is a requirement, but also might, the wheels might be greased a little bit in terms of getting things through.
Absolutely. I think this is the where you have to dig deep, right? And I think the other piece of this is that this has pushed us forward faster. It's one of the times in our lives where we were planning, okay, let's do this. This is up and coming, but we weren't really up against a clock in that capacity from an innovation standpoint. I think COVID put many of our organizations on the clock. And it was one of those where you have to move now. It was no longer a wait and see, keep testing. It was like we have to innovate as quickly as possible in order to adjust for our audiences, for our internal needs, for our external needs. All of that needed to happen. And it almost felt like from one day to the next.
I'm going to step on a third rail here a little bit, but I want to ask you guys about political activism in sports. Another thing that is changing a lot in the past year or so. Susanne, it's a hot topic at the Olympic level. The IOC is kind of deciding what it's going to look like in Tokyo and moving forward. Team USA has said that you will not be punishing athletes who make political statements during the games. The IOC has the option of doing kind of whatever it wants. I'm curious if you think from a business standpoint, the argument against political activism in sports is that it alienates people. I'm curious if you guys see that argument changing given also the changing nature of the political conversation in the U.S.
Well, let me say that, first of all, it is a very divisive topic. Even here in the U.S., where I'd say we are on the cutting edge of athletes really using their voices for things that they care about, I get an equal number of very angry letters and emails from people who think it's terrible that an athlete would protest, particularly on the podium or during the national anthem, and an equal number of letters from people saying this is wonderful, that athletes who are looked up to and who are role models have an opportunity to raise their voices. So the decision that we made, which was very specifically that we would not sanction anyone who speaks out specifically on issues of human rights or speaking out on issues about disadvantaged populations, that is something that we just did not feel morally we could sanction someone for that. The IOC is in a very difficult position. They have always traditionally tried to say, politics is outside of sport. But sport is a part of our world, and people's right to speak up on things that they think are wrong is a part of our world. So making sure that athletes have a place to speak out. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the podium. The majority of athletes, by the way, don't believe in protesting on the podium, but we need to make available to athletes outlets for them to say what is important to them, because people will listen when they speak.
And where do your sponsors stand? I mean, you were a CMO of Visa for a long time. You oversaw one of the biggest marketing portfolios in the country. Where do the companies that you guys partner with stand on whether they want to see it, they want to encourage it, they want a little bit of it, but not a lot? Where do they typically come down on that?
I'd say in general, our sponsors really understand, particularly, it's a very American value, this freedom of speech and fighting for what you think is right. That's not universally held in all countries, but most of our sponsors who have very strong domestic roots here in the US really understand that this is a part of how you make things better, that you need to let people who are looked up to and who are role models in our country say the truth, say what is on their minds, and begin to make change happen. So I would say we've had very good support from our sponsors in supporting particularly the athletes' right to speak out.
Danita, you spent a lot of time at the W, what I would argue the sports league in the US, where sports and politics are merging probably the most. I'm curious to get your thoughts on the business side of this conversation. If your conversations with partners, sponsors, sales side, are they changing at all around this topic? Do you feel as though anything is moving in this regard?
I feel that they're supportive in it. I think when partners, speak specifically to the WNBA, I think partners, they know that we're working with a group of women, and a lot of what they're already experiencing is at a disadvantage from the beginning, right? So when they sign on, they know that part of their signing on as a partner is to help move that forward. And so it's an opportunity to create change. And I think as businesses and organizations continue to move forward, they want to go beyond their day-to-day practice. They want to use their practice as an opportunity to create change. So I feel like partners at this day and age, when it comes to the sports world and entertainment, I feel like there's an understanding that the work that you do will also help move something forward or have an opportunity to create change. And I also think it's an expectation from partners now that the work that we do as organizations creates change and makes impact in our communities. And so I respect that upon them, and it's our duties as an organization to make sure that we bring that to life.
How do we get fans on board with that? I mean, Susanne mentioned she's getting letters on both sides of this discussion. How do you hold fans' hands who maybe need to be handheld to get on board with that? Do you not worry about that and assume they're going to come eventually? How do you think about the fan portion of that interaction?
I think part of one of the pieces that we use, we'll say like all are welcome or all are united when we talk about DCU, right? And we're continuing to work on that and evolve as an organization. We still have work to do. We internally, externally still have work to do for that. And I'm excited about what we have in front of us. But when it comes to the fans, just as Susan said, everybody's going to have difference of opinions. We don't have to be in agreement. But one thing that I think is important is human rights. Period. Take the political word out of it. It's about human rights and it's people and people being treated fairly. And I think that becomes the focus. And it's okay. There are going to be fans that may not like some of the things. There are going to be fans that love some of the things, but that's, it's like that freedom of thought, freedom of speech, as Susanne mentioned, and that's okay. But doesn't mean you still aren't welcomed, right? And I think it's about finding that balance between the two. And for us, even too, when I think about what we were doing before, when I was in the W, we would encourage people to make action, right? So we wouldn't say go, we didn't necessarily who to vote for. Our players did that in their own rights, but we were just saying, can you get registered? Are you educated about these things? When it comes to different issues, that's usually how we as organizations present that. It's the educational aspect, not necessarily saying that you have to do this, you have to do that. We're saying, let us help create an opportunity for education, conversation, and how you can potentially impact and help change this. That's the angle that, we truly approach in this.
Oh, you saw me pop on, Eben. I was like, he's going to ask another question, but wait, I just got in there at the last minute. And Danita, I would like to mention, by the way, that some franchises have lip service, but you are the president of business operations of DC United. It's also worth noting that they recently hired Lucy Rushton as their general manager, only the second GM in league history. So really on the business side and on the technical sporting side, women are leading DC United. So now there's no added pressure, but you better win.
I got to work on that. I got to win off the field too. So
you better make some money and you better win. Other than that, though, no pressure. It's all good.
Thank you.
Well, Danita, Susanne, thank you so much for taking the time.